The fall of Rome and Ireland's early medieval dawn. Welcome, friend. Make yourself comfortable. Relax your shoulders and let the tranquility of history wash over you. This evening, we'll journey back to the mists of time to a land of stone, song, and shadow, an island where mighty castles would one day rise from the earth, where fiercely loyal clans guarded their honor, and where ancient myths still whisper on the wind. If you're enjoying this journey, please help us reach our first milestone, 1,000 likes. A simple click from you keeps this story alive a little longer. Now let's begin. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire plunged much of Europe into a period of profound uncertainty. Roads fell into disrepair, becoming impassable in many places. Vital trade networks shattered, severing the flow of goods and ideas. And once vibrant cities, teeming with merchants and scholars, became hushed and vulnerable, shadows of their former selves. The bustling markets and lively intellectual discourse were replaced by a pervasive sense of unease and instability. The very fabric of civilized life seemed to unravel. But Ireland's experience was markedly different. Rome had never directly controlled this island on the edge of the known world. Its inhabitants, the Gaels, had existed outside the empire's reach, living a life largely untouched by Roman influence. They tended their cattle, shared stories around crackling fires, and built their own small, independent kingdoms governed by their own customs and traditions. While the fall of Rome felt like a cataclysmic event in many parts of Europe, a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of society. In Ireland, it was more akin to a distant storm cloud, visible on the horizon, but not immediately threatening. The impact was felt, certainly, but the island remained largely unaffected by the immediate turmoil. However, that distant storm did bring about change. With the Roman Empire's demise, travelers and wanderers, seeking refuge or opportunity, began to drift across the land. Ireland, previously somewhat isolated, became a crossroads where new currents of faith and knowledge could take root and flourish. Christianity, already gaining a foothold on the island, found fertile ground in this period of transition. Missionaries, carrying a message of hope and a different vision of life, one not solely defined by the warrior's code, spread their teachings. Gradually, the old ways, the worship of ancient idols and the practices of the Druids, began to yield to the growing influence of the Christian faith, symbolized by the cross and the psalm. This transformation wasn't instantaneous. It unfolded over generations, like the slow and steady breaking of dawn over a misty field. The change was subtle, yet powerful and enduring. Life in early medieval Ireland was a complex tapestry woven from threads of hardship and unexpected beauty. Picture narrow, winding paths cutting through dense forests, the aroma of peat smoke rising from humble wooden huts, and herds of cattle moving like shadows across expansive grasslands. Cattle represented wealth, far exceeding the value of coins. Families measured their power and status not simply by the sharpness of their swords, but by the size of their herds. Kings ruled over tiny territories, sometimes encompassing only a few valleys, and loyalties shifted as readily as the wind. Yet, amidst this fluidity of alliances and the ever-present threat of conflict, a distinct rhythm permeated life. Feasting, raiding, storytelling, and the often fragile maintenance of law, all elements of an intricate, cyclical existence. What truly distinguished this era was the manner in which memory was preserved. Without the extensive libraries and grand stone amphitheaters of the Roman world, Ireland relied heavily on the power of the human voice. Poets and bards became the living archives, the keepers of the past. They memorized and recited genealogies, sang of the victories of warriors, and recounted myths that seemed older than time itself. Through their skill and dedication, the past was not simply a distant echo. It walked amongst the living, influencing the present and shaping the future. But the spoken word alone couldn't ensure the preservation of knowledge for eternity. As monasteries began to appear along rivers and coastlines, monks diligently bent over parchment, their pens scratching patiently in the flickering candlelight. This marked the beginning of Ireland's growing reputation as a center of learning, though the process was still in its nascent stages. For the time being, life remained closely tied to the land and the sea, with constant dangers lurking around every bend. Raiding was commonplace, occurring not only between rival clans, but also across the sea. The Irish themselves launched expeditions to the western coast of Britain, engaging in plunder and, occasionally, establishing settlements. Even within this climate of violence, however, a strange sense of order prevailed. Raids were governed by unwritten rules, codes of honor, and established expectations. The chaos unleashed by the fall of Rome, ironically, provided Ireland with a unique opportunity. Because it had never been conquered by Rome, the island was free to forge its own destiny, deeply rooted in ancient traditions, yet open to the embrace of new ideas and influences. If one were to stand on a windswept cliff overlooking the vast Atlantic, one could sense the powerful pull of both the past and the future. Behind, the sacred groves of the Druids were fading into memory, though not entirely forgotten. Before new monasteries were rising, their bells summoning the faithful to prayer at dawn, and always present was the land itself, rugged, green, enduring, a steadfast presence throughout the ceaseless changes. This was the early medieval dawn of Ireland, a period when the shadow of Rome receded, allowing Ireland to begin crafting its own unique narrative, a story woven from the diverse threads of kings and monks, warriors and poets, castles and myths. It was merely the beginning of a long and complex journey, but the rhythms of medieval life were already stirring, subtly shaping the course of events to come. Monks, manuscripts, and the island of saints and scholars. The story of Ireland in the early Middle Ages soon shifts inward, away from the clamor of raiding parties and the shifting allegiances of kings, into the hushed serenity of stone-walled monasteries. Here, monks lived lives of discipline and profound silence, their days measured not by the clash of battle, but by the rhythmic chiming of bells. Morning bells, noon bells, evening bells. Each chime was a strand in the fabric of prayer, weaving time into a sacred, ordered pattern. These monasteries transcended their function as mere places of worship. They became the pulsating heart of Ireland's growing reputation as the island of saints and scholars. Imagine stepping inside one of these monasteries. The faint scent of beeswax and wood smoke hangs in the air. The damp chill of the stone walls clings to the skin. Candles flicker against intricately carved wooden crosses, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In a corner, a monk hunches low over a page of vellum, painstakingly copying sacred texts. Each stroke of his quill is slow, deliberate, precise. The glistening ink catches the faint light of the candles before sinking into parchment. He is not hurried. His work is intended to endure for centuries. The manuscripts created in these monastic scriptoria will become priceless treasures. Some were simple, containing the words of scripture in plain lettering, while others blossomed into breathtaking masterpieces. Gold leaf, vibrant blues derived from crushed lapis lazuli, and intricate designs featuring spirals, beasts, and saints adorn the pages. It is said that the monks who worked on the Book of Kells, perhaps the most renowned of these illuminated manuscripts, believed their art to be an act of prayer. Each carefully decorated word was a gesture of elevation toward the divine. The remarkable contribution of these monasteries wasn't merely their artistic achievements, but the knowledge they preserved. While much of Europe witnessed the burning of libraries and a decline in learning following the fall of Rome, Irish monks diligently collected fragments of Latin texts, meticulously copied them, and faithfully passed them on to future generations. They saved not only their own cultural heritage, but also vital pieces of the wider world's accumulated wisdom. In their small, sparsely lit cells, these men, who rarely ventured beyond the confines of their monasteries, became the guardians of civilization's memory. Yet, these monasteries were never entirely isolated. Pilgrims journeyed across the sea to study there, and Irish monks themselves embarked on voyages, carrying books under their arms and walking staff in hand. They traveled as far as the Alps, establishing monasteries abroad, and spreading the influence of Irish learning and spirituality across Europe. To those who encountered them, they seemed almost otherworldly, wandering saints from a distant, rain-swept island, wholly dedicated to God and the pursuit of knowledge. Even within the monastic walls, life wasn't completely untouched by the wider world. Cattle raids sometimes reached their gates, and the monks were forced to defend not only their precious books, but their very lives. However, their response was rarely one of direct military confrontation. Instead, they constructed round towers, tall, slender beacons of stone. When danger threatened, bells would peal, and the monks would ascend ladders into the towers, pulling the steps up after them. There, they would wait, their manuscripts safely hidden in alcoves while the raiders passed by. In the quiet intervals between threats, the rhythm of study and prayer would resume. Students sat cross-legged on rush-covered floors, listening attentively as elders recited scriptures and stories, weaving together the sacred and the poetic. To the Irish, there was no rigid divide between learning and imagination. A monk might spend his morning immersed in the Gospel of John, and his evening reciting a tale of Cuchulainn or Finn MacCool. Faith and myth coexisted, nourishing the soul in different ways. This unique blending of devotion, art, and storytelling is what made Ireland shine so brightly during the early medieval centuries. Later travelers, awestruck by the concentration of monasteries, aptly described it as an island of saints and scholars, a phrase that has resonated like a blessing ever since. And when one considers this, it's remarkable to realize that those monks, toiling quietly by candlelight, could never have imagined the enduring impact of their work, reaching not only across Europe, but across the centuries to us. Sitting here, centuries later, listening in the darkness, Viking longships on Irish shores, the tranquil peace of the candlelit monasteries did not endure forever. One morning, sometime in the late 8th century, watchmen along the Irish coast would have witnessed a strange sight on the horizon. Lo, swift-moving shadows gliding across the sea. These were no ordinary merchant vessels or local fishing boats. Their hulls were long and sleek, their prows carved into the menacing heads of dragons. Their sails, wide and crimson, stood out starkly against the gray sky. The first Viking longships had arrived in Ireland. For those on shore, the sight must have instilled a chill deeper than the ocean wind. These ships were designed for speed and surprise. They could navigate shallow rivers, vanish behind headlands, and launch attacks without warning. When the raiders landed, they came not for farmland or peaceful settlements, but for wealth, gold, silver, cattle, and sometimes captives. And the richest treasures of Ireland at that time were found within the monasteries. Imagine the scene. Monks bent over their manuscripts, bells ringing for prayer, suddenly shattered by the clash of steel outside. Long-haired men wielding axes burst through doors, seizing chalices, reliquaries, and jewel covers torn from sacred books. Candles tumbled, smoke filled the air, and the sacred silence was violently broken. To later generations, the Viking raid seemed like a sudden storm that swept across the island, brutal, unpredictable, and utterly devastating. But storms, for all their destructive power, also reshaped the landscape they strike. The Vikings did not merely plunder. Over time, they began to return repeatedly, familiarizing themselves with the coastlines, wintering in sheltered bays, and engaging in trade alongside raiding. What began as terror gradually evolved into a complex entanglement. Irish chieftains, though enraged by their losses, also began to perceive opportunities. Alliances could be forged, weapons procured, and rival clans weakened with Viking assistance. Yet, for ordinary villagers, the fear remained palpable. Fires flickered on the horizon where once only fields and woods had stood. Children were hushed as families sought refuge in the hills and forests, listening anxiously for crunch of boots on wet soil. The memory of those early raids lingered long after the smoke cleared, transforming into stories that depicted the raiders as almost supernatural beings. Giants with burning eyes, demons from the sea. The truth, while more human, was no less terrifying. What gave the Vikings their decisive advantage was not only their ferocity, but their remarkable ships. The longship was a marvel of naval engineering, light enough to be carried over short stretches of land, fast enough to chase the wind, and sturdy enough to withstand the roughest seas. These vessels were extensions of the raiders themselves, potent symbols of both freedom and fear in equal measure. For Ireland, the arrival of these ships marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would irrevocably alter its towns, its trade, and even its bloodlines. In a strange way, however, their presence added to the complexity and richness of Irish life. Ireland was never a simple place of one people or one culture. It was a dynamic blend of Gaelic, Christian, poetic, and now Norse threads. In the decade that followed, the longships would return, bringing not only raiders, but also settlers who would shape new towns, new customs, and new rivalries. The sea, once a mere barrier and a source of sustenance, had become a highway for profound change. If one were to stand on a cliff during those years, gazing out the horizon, one might have wondered what the next sail would bring: friendship, trade, or fire. That inherent uncertainty became an integral part of Ireland's medieval story, a constant reminder that the island's fate was intertwined not only with its soil, but also with the restless waters that surrounded it. The birth of Viking Irish towns, Dublin, Waterford, Limerick. Initially, the Vikings came and went like storms. They struck, they burned, and then vanished back into the sea. But storms do not last forever. And these raiders, after years of plunder, began to view Ireland as more than just a target. They saw its rivers, its fertile land, and its sheltered bays. Instead of sailing away, some decided to stay. From this decision emerged the towns that would later become Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. Consider how profoundly different this must have felt to the people of the island. For centuries, Ireland had been a land of scattered villages, monasteries, and tiny, fiercely independent kingdoms. There were no true cities, no sprawling marketplaces where goods from distant lands were exchanged. But now, on the edges of rivers and coastlines, timber walls began to rise. Behind them, rows of houses, workshops, and trading posts gradually took shape. Smoke curled from hearths where metal was forged and bread was baked, and the shouts of merchants echoed where once only the waves and wind had spoken. Dublin, perhaps the most renowned of these Viking-founded towns, began as a long fort, a fortified ship base at the mouth of the River Liffey. What started as a simple military encampment soon grew into a thriving settlement, and then into a bustling hub of trade. Imagine narrow, muddy lanes thronged with traders, Norsemen offering amber and furs from the north, Irish chieftains arriving with cattle and hides, and even goods that had journeyed from as far away as the Mediterranean. Suddenly, Ireland was linked to the wider world in a way it never had been before. Waterford and Limerick followed similar patterns. Each began with raiders pulling their ships up onto riverbanks. But over time, the allure of permanent settlement proved too strong to resist. These places became crossroads where Gaelic and Norse lives intertwined. Marriages were made, children grew up speaking both languages, and customs blended into something entirely new. It wasn't always peaceful. Conflict flared frequently, and battles were fought over control of these valuable towns. But even amidst the rivalry, the sense of permanence took root. Life within these early towns was noisy, crowded, and vibrantly alive. Picture blacksmiths hammering iron, women weaving wool dyed in bright colors, fishermen unloading their catch, and children running through the narrow streets. The air was thick with a potent mixture of smells: salt from the sea, smoke from hearths, and the musky scent of animals brought in for sale. Compared to the quiet rhythm of the countryside, town life must have seemed overwhelming, yet also brimming with opportunity. And here's something truly remarkable. From a mingling of Irish and Norse cultures, new identities began to emerge. These weren't simply Vikings living on Irish soil. They became something in between, a people often called the Hiberno-Norse. They retained the seafaring skills and trading spirit of their ancestors, but they also adapted to Irish laws, landholding customs, and even Irish names. Over generations, these mixed communities profoundly reshaped Ireland's social fabric. The monasteries that had once feared the longships now found themselves trading with the towns that had sprung from them. Gold and silver objects once stolen in raids might now be exchanged in bustling marketplaces. It was a strange twist of fate. The very people who had come as destroyers ended up laying down roots that would become an enduring part of Ireland's story for centuries to come. If you wandered the streets of Dublin or Waterford today, beneath the modern buildings and busy traffic, the ghosts of those wooden walls and narrow lanes are still there. They remind us that medieval Ireland was not a place cut off from the world, but one deeply connected through sea routes, trade, and the mingling of diverse peoples. And so, from raids came towns, from fear came trade, and from strangers came neighbors. Ireland's medieval dawn had entered a new stage, one of bustling towns and shifting identities, where the old ways and the new ways learned to coexist. High kings and the dream of a united island. By the time Viking towns were flourishing along the rivers and coasts, another, older story was unfolding inland, a story now sharpened by the presence of the Norsemen. Ireland had always been a patchwork of small kingdoms, each ruled by a local king. Some controlled only a handful of valleys, Others commanded wider plains, but none had ever succeeded in unifying the entire island under a single crown. Yet, during this period, the idea of a High King, a ruler powerful enough to unite Ireland, began to burn brighter than ever before. This was not a simple aspiration. Kings were bound by complex family ties, bitter rivalries, and the ancient code of honor that often demanded feuds be settled through raids and battles. Alliances shifted with dizzying speed. Today's ally could easily become tomorrow's enemy. Yet, at the ceremonial hill of Tara, the ancient seat of kingship, a persistent vision lingered. The belief that one man, if chosen and recognized by the other kings, could rise above all others. The title of High King was more than just a political designation. It was a potent symbol of unity, representing a land held together by more than mere force. The drama, of course, resided in the struggle to claim that title. Ambitious rulers rose, proclaiming themselves High King of Ireland, only to see their authority immediately challenged by others who refused to submit. It was a game of shifting loyalties, of lavish feasts and treacherous betrayals, of armies mustering on mist-shrouded fields. Some kings sought legitimacy by marrying into powerful clans. Others forged alliances with the church, seeking the blessing of monks who could lend moral weight to their claims. Imagine the tension within a great hall. The crackling fire, warriors lining the walls with spears in hand, and two kings seated at opposite ends of the room. Each man waits for the other to speak first, acutely aware that words could carry as much weight as blades. Promises are made, oaths sworn, yet beneath the veneer of polite diplomacy, every eye knows that steel might soon decide the outcome. The Vikings further complicated matters. Some Irish kings fought fiercely against them, viewing the foreigners as a direct threat to the very concept of Irish sovereignty. Others struck opportunistic deals, using Viking warriors as allies to bolster their claims. This only intensified the existing rivalries, as those who relied on foreign swords were accused of betraying the ancient Gaelic order. Yet, even with this profound division, the dream of a united Ireland was never entirely abandoned. It flickered like a candle in the wind, sometimes bright, sometimes dim, but never completely extinguished. What made the High King's position so elusive was Ireland's very nature. Its landscape, fragmented by natural barriers, mountains, bogs, and rivers, kept regions apart. Clans were fiercely protective of their independence, and no leader could hope to hold them together for long without constant struggle. Yet, every few generations, a figure would emerge, larger than life, whose ambition extended beyond his own borders. These were the men who, for a time, held the title of High King, even if their reigns were fragile and perpetually contested. For ordinary people, farmers, herders, and villagers, the grand rivalries of kings might have seemed distant, like storms flashing on far-off hills. And yet, the outcome mattered profoundly. A powerful High King could bring a measure of stability, reducing raids, enforcing laws, and creating enough peace for crops to grow and families to thrive. A weak or absent High King, on the other hand, meant chaos. Feuding neighbors, stolen cattle, and uncertainty spreading like wildfire. In this delicate balance of ambition and resistance, of rivalry and fleeting unity, Ireland's medieval story deepened. The dream of a single crown binding the entire island remained just that, a dream. But it was a dream that refused to die, and it set the stage for the emergence of figures whose names are still spoken with reverence centuries later. Brian Boru and the Battle of Clontarf. From a tangled web of rival clans and ambitious kings, one figure ascended above all others, Brian Boru. His story represents perhaps the closest Ireland came in the Middle Ages to realizing the dream of a truly united land. Born in the 10th century into the Dál G clan of Munster, Brian was not destined by birth to rule the entire island. Yet, through sheer determination, shrewd alliances, and relentless battles, he carved his way from a regional chieftain to the seat of the High King at Tara. Brian was no ordinary ruler. He possessed a profound understanding that power wasn't solely about the sword, but also about patience and strategic timing. He struck when his rivals were weak, cultivated alliances with the church to lend legitimacy to his rule, and carefully wove a network of loyalties that extended across much of Ireland. By the early 11th century, he had become a potent symbol of unity, though not all accepted him. Many regarded him as a usurper. Others viewed him as a savior, His reign was simultaneously admired and resented, for in a land of fierce independence, no single man could ever truly hold every heart. And then came the great clash that would forever define his name, the Battle of Clontarf. The year was 1014, and on the plains just north of Dublin, Brian's forces confronted an alliance of Norsemen and rebellious Irish clans. The very air crackled with tension. On one side, Brian's army, drawn from Munster, Connaught, and loyal allies, stood determined to break the power of the Vikings in Ireland once and for all. On the other side, Norse warriors from Dublin and beyond, joined by Irish lords who had no desire to see Brian's dominance continue. Prepared for battle, imagine the dawn of that Good Friday morning. Mist clung low over the river Tolka as shields were raised, spears braced, and war cries ripped through the air. The ensuing clash was deafening, waves of men colliding in a maelstrom of iron and oak. For hours, the battle raged, the sounds of clashing steel and cries of the wounded echoing across the marshland. Chroniclers describe it as one of the bloodiest struggles in Irish history, a field where kings, chieftains, and common soldiers alike fell together. Brian himself was an old man by then, well over 70 years of age. He did not ride into fray, but remained in his tent, praying as the battle unfolded. His presence, though distant from the battle lines, served as a powerful rallying force. His men fought knowing that they carried not only his will, but the hopes of an entire nation. And in the end, Brian's army triumphed. The Norse power in Ireland was decisively broken. Though Viking towns remained, their political influence never fully recovered. Yet victory came at a cruel cost. As the day waned and the battlefield fell silent, Brian was found slain in his tent, struck down by a fleeing Norse warrior. The High King, who had brought Ireland closer to unity than any before him, did not live to see the fruits of his triumph. His death cast a long shadow over the celebrations, turning triumph in profound tragedy. Still his legacy endured. For centuries, poets and storytellers recounted the tale of Brian Boru as a figure larger than life, a king who dared to dream of a united Ireland and who stood firm against both native rivals and foreign foes. The Battle of Clontarf became more than just a single battle. It was remembered as a pivotal turning point, a moment when Ireland's destiny seemed to hang precariously on the edge of a blade. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, the land itself bore witness. Fields scarred, rivers stained, and stories passed from mouth to ear. And even now, 1,000 years later, the name Brian Boru carries with the echo of that fateful Good Friday when Ireland's future seemed to hang suspended in the mist. Norman invasion, a new power lands in 1169. Half a century after Brian Boru's death, Ireland slipped back into familiar rhythm of rivalries. Clans rose and fell. Alliances were forged and broken. Small kingdoms stubbornly resisted the weight of unity. The Norse towns remained, but their power was now interwoven with Ireland's internal struggles. For a time, it seemed, the island's narrative continued its familiar course. Then, in 1169, everything changed. A new force arrived, not in sleek, swift longships, but in ponderous vessels bearing armored knights, the Normans. Their arrival, like so many Irish sagas, began with a feud. Diremate Mac Murchada, the deposed king of Leinster, sought allies to reclaim his throne. He sailed to England, finding them amongst the ambitious Norman lords who had established themselves there. Having conquered England a century prior, Ireland presented itself as a tempting prize, rich, fragmented, and vulnerable. Diremate's promise of land, power, and even the hand of his daughter Aoife secured their agreement. Thus, the first Norman soldiers landed on the southern coast, their chainmail gleaming under the overcast skies. To the Irish, these warriors must have seemed unlike any they had encountered. The Vikings were fierce raiders, undoubtedly, but the Normans came as conquerors. Their tactics were disciplined, their armor practically impenetrable, their war horses expertly trained. While Irish warriors relied on speed and courage, the Normans fought with formation and overwhelming force. Battles, once chaotic affairs, became crushing demonstrations of military precision. Waterford fell first, its defenses overwhelmed. Wexford followed swiftly, and the Norman foothold expanded. Diremate, with their aid, regained Leinster. However, his victory was not solely his own. Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, took Aoife as his bride, acquiring not just a claim to Leinster, but a deeper stake in Ireland's soil. This marriage was more than a personal union. It irrevocably bound Ireland's fate to the ambitions of a new power. News of the Norman success spread rapidly, accompanied by growing unease. Other Irish kings, too late, recognized the impending danger. The Normans hadn't merely come to assist Diarmait. They intended to remain. Castles, unprecedented in the Irish landscape, rose from the ground. Stone towers, firmly planted, symbolized permanence, a stark contrast to the fleeting Viking encampments. These were anchors, each one proclaiming, "We are here, and we will not leave." However, the Irish narrative, as always, was complex. Some Irish lords fiercely resisted the Normans, while others forged alliances, perceiving their strength as a means to outmaneuver rivals. This mirrored past patterns. Foreign swords employed in native conflicts, but the stakes were considerably higher. The Normans weren't content with alliances. They demanded dominion, tribute, and absolute control. Across the sea, King Henry II of England took notice. He feared his Norman barons and Ireland might establish an independent kingdom beyond his control. In 1171, he crossed the Irish Sea with his own fleet, landing at Waterford with hundreds of knights. This marked the first time an English king had set foot on Irish soil, initiating centuries of entanglement, conquest, and resistance. For those who lived through it, the invasion must have felt unstoppable, an insurmountable wave. The era of wooden forts and cattle raids belonged to the past. Stone castles, mounted knights, and feudal law were reshaping the island. Ireland's medieval history had begun a new chapter. One penned not only by its kings and clans, but by a transoceanic power whose shadow would darken with each passing century. The rise of castles, more than just stone and strategy. The Norman arrival didn't merely result in battlefield victories. It fundamentally altered the landscape. Their most enduring legacy was a castle. Previously, Ireland's fortifications were a ring fort of earth and timber, intended to protect families and livestock during times of danger. The Normans introduced a different approach. Stone towers seemingly rising directly from the earth, imposing and unyielding. Initially, construction was rapid. Wooden Modern Bailey castles proliferated across Leinster and Munster, raised mounds of earth topped with timber towers, encircled by ditches and palisades. These weren't built for eternity, but their swift appearance instilled fear, demonstrating the Normans' ability to rapidly assert their dominance. Once their grip on land solidified, what gave way to stone, signifying permanence. Imagine witnessing one of these new castles for the first time, a gray keep rising above verdant fields, its walls far exceeding the height of any ring fort, its sharp angles contrasting the rolling hills. From a distance, the message was clear. This was not a settlement to raid or defy. It was an unconquerable fortress, a symbol of absolute authority. The interior differed vastly from the smoky halls of Irish kings. Norman castles embodied order and strategic planning. The Great Hall, the heart of the castle, served as a dining hall and council chamber where lords feasted under high rafters and made decisions impacting entire regions. Stone staircases led to upper chambers where tapestries mitigated the chill, while storerooms below contained salted meats, barrels of ale, and readily accessible weapons. Even the smallest detail spoke of control. Narrow arrow slits for defense, iron-bound doors capable of withstanding battering rams, and courtyards where soldiers drilled in tight formations. Life surrounding these castles transformed. Villages often sprang up in their shadows, populated by craftsmen, merchants, and farmers who catered to the garrison's needs. Markets thrived outside the gates, where Irish and Normans alike traded, though always under the watchful eyes of the lord's men. For the local Gaelic clans, these castles were simultaneously a threat and a point of attraction. Attacking them was nearly impossible, but ignoring them was inconceivable. They redefined trade, law, and the power balance. Yet castles were more than just walls and towers. They were strategic deployments. Each castle's location was carefully chosen. Atop a hill, overlooking a river crossing near fertile plains, or guarding the approach to a Viking-founded town. Together, they formed a network of control, enabling the Normans to maintain dominion over territories far from their initial landing sites. The land itself was being claimed one stone block at a time. To the Irish living within their shadow, these castles must have seemed both foreign and immutable. They dominated the skyline, constant reminders of a new order, backed by an overwhelming force. Yet, they also became integrated into Ireland's landscape, absorbed into its history and struggles. Some were captured by Gaelic clans during rebellions, others abandoned and left to decay. Many endured, their ruins standing as silent testaments to the era of conquest. If you travel through Ireland today, you'll find them. Stone shells on hillsides, ivy crawling over crumbling walls, windows open to the wind. They serve as reminders that power wasn't solely wielded by mounted warriors. It was also embodied in stone, designed to outlast the men who built it. These castles were not simply homes or fortresses. They were symbols of the transforming island caught between ancient traditions and the weight of foreign rule. The Gaelic clans and their struggle for survival. While Norman castles spread across the landscape, Ireland's Gaelic clans didn't simply disappear. For centuries, they have been the island's lifeblood, their power rooted not in stone, but in kinship, land, and tradition. Each clan possessed its unique lineage, tracing ancestry through generations, often with narratives blurring the lines between history and myth. Clan membership defined identity, origin, and allies in battle. The Normans' arrival shook this world, but didn't destroy it. Many clans adapted swiftly, retreating to the rugged west and north, where mountains and bogs hindered Norman control. Others openly defied the Normans, raiding their strongholds, striking quickly, then vanishing into forests and hills. Life became a precarious balancing act, resisting foreign power while combating rival clans. For old rivalries didn't disappear simply because a new enemy had emerged. To understand the clans, imagine a chieftain seated in his wooden hall, a fire blazing at the center. His warriors gathered closely. Surrounding him are poets, lawmakers, and foster sons from allied families, all integral to the clan's intricate structure. Loyalty wasn't merely expected. It was paramount. A man without a clan lacked protection, and protection was life itself. The clans adhered to Brehon law, a system predating Christianity in Ireland. This legal system prioritized restitution over punishment. Stolen cattle required repayment. Injuries necessitated compensation. Honor and balance were valued more than a feudal lord's iron fist. The Normans introduced their own feudal system of strict hierarchy. However, in Gaelic heartlands, ancient traditions persisted, stubborn and resilient. Survival, however, came at a price. Some clans formed uneasy truces with Norman lords, even intermarrying when advantageous. These alliances were fragile, often as fleeting as they were forged. Others fiercely clung to independence, retreating deeper into wild landscapes that proved difficult for the Normans to subdue. Western Ireland, with its mountains, lakes, and bogs, became a stronghold of Gaelic life, a place where ancient traditions could endure. Daily survival encompassed more than warfare. It revolved around cattle, the cornerstone of Gaelic wealth. Herds were moved across seasonal pastures, fiercely guarded against raiders, and celebrated in feasts reinforcing community bonds. Clan strength wasn't solely measured by its warriors, but by its ability to protect its cattle. Alongside this tangible wealth existed intangible treasures, songs, poems, and genealogies preserved in memory and passed down through generations. Forgetting one's genealogy was almost as shameful as losing a battle, for ancestry formed the bedrock of honor. Fosterage further strengthened clan ties. Children were frequently raised in allied families' households, forging bonds deeper than treaties. A boy raised in another clan's hall became not only kin but a pledge of trust, deterring families from turning against one another. This practice imbued Gaelic politics with resilience, creating a web of loyalties across Ireland that Norman feudalism struggled to unravel. To the Normans, the clans may have seemed disorganized, even primitive compared to their stone castles and written charters. However, the clan's strength lay in their adaptability. They could blend into the landscape, strike unexpectedly, and rely on kinship ties that no foreign lord could easily break. Their halls may not have been made of stone, but they were fortified by loyalty and tradition, blending the practical with the symbolic. Poets, Philly, were revered almost as much as warriors. for they carried memory in verse. A clan without a poet lacked a voice. In times of conflict, a single poem could inflict deeper wounds than a sword, while praise sung in a chieftain's hall could immortalize him long after his death. These cultural weapons were as vital as spears and shields in the struggle for survival. The Gaelic clan struggle wasn't merely military. It was cultural, spiritual, and personal. Every feast, every law court, every bardic poem was an act of survival, a declaration of continued existence. Even in the shadow of Norman castles, the clans clung to their ways, preserving the beating heart of Gaelic Ireland. The Pale, a divided land of Normans and natives. By the late Middle Ages, Ireland was no longer a unified expanse of clan territories and scattered Norman castles. It had become a divided land, with the divide most evident in the area known as the Pale. This was the heartland of Norman rule, centered around Dublin, where English law, customs, and authority held sway. Beyond its borders, however, Gaelic Ireland persisted, untamed and deeply rooted in ancient traditions. The very name Pale denoted a boundary, a fence, a line separating two worlds. Within the Pale, life was governed by feudal order. Markets bustled with English goods. Courts echoed with laws written in French and Latin. And the architecture reflected a different way of life. Stone houses, parish churches, and walled towns that resembled England more than surrounding Irish countryside. For those within the Pale, allegiance was to the English crown, though even this loyalty could be tenuous. Step outside the Pale's borders, and the picture shifted dramatically. The Pale's laws held no weight in the vast territories controlled by Gaelic chieftains. Here, cattle still measured wealth, poets still recited ancient genealogies, and Brehon laws were practiced much as they had been before the Normans arrived. To the Pale's inhabitants, these areas were lawless. To the clans who lived there, it was simply home. The contrast was stark. Imagine a Norman merchant in Dublin, dressed in linen and wool, bargaining over spices from distant lands. Then, picture a Gaelic farmer a few miles away, herding cattle through wet fields, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the rain. These two men lived in the same country, breathed the same damp air, yet their worlds were separated by language, law, and custom. However, the boundary was never absolute. Trade, marriages, and even loyalties crossed it. Norman lords residing too long beyond the Pale often adopted Gaelic ways, embracing Irish speech, dress, and law. Some were even accused of becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves. The English crown viewed this with suspicion, fearing the loss of its Irish foothold. To prevent this, strict rules were enacted, forbidding intermarriage, banning the Irish language among settlers, and enforcing adherence to English customs. The Statutes of Kilkenny, 1366, formalized these prohibitions, but rules on parchment are easily disregarded when life dictates otherwise. The Pale was both a sanctuary and a prison. For those within, it offered stability, markets, and protection of the English crown, but also isolated them, surrounded by land they perceived as hostile and unpredictable. For those outside, the Pale was a foreign intrusion, a challenge to their sovereignty. Raids and counter-raid were common, the boundary fluctuating with each generation's conflicts. Gaelic warriors would sometimes ride to its very walls, seizing cattle or burning fields, a potent reminder that the Pale's power wasn't absolute. For ordinary people, life must have felt like a precarious balancing act. A farmer near the border might owe rent to a Norman lord, but still rely on kinship ties with Gaelic clan. A trader might bring goods to Dublin by day and carry Gaelic stories back to his family by night. Marriages sometimes united families across the divide, forging bonds that defied royal decrees. The boundary was real, yet permeable, alive with both exchange and hostility. Even religion blurred the lines. Both worlds were Christian, yet devotion manifested differently. Within the Pale, worship followed English customs, Latin prayers and stone churches. Beyond, Gaelic traditions blended faith with folklore, where holy wells, sacred stones, and festivals tied to ancient rhythms still shaped devotion. Priests and friars sometimes traversed both worlds, carrying fragments of each. Ultimately, the Pale became a symbol of division in medieval Ireland, a stark reminder that the island was not one, but many, its people caught between two worlds. Yet, this very division ensured that neither side entirely erase the other. Gaelic traditions endured even in the shadow of Norman walls, and Norman ways left their mark even in Gaelic strongholds. It was a land of tension, yet also a blending, where identities were never straightforward, and survival meant navigating both worlds simultaneously. Daily life inside a medieval Irish castle. Step inside the heavy gates of a medieval Irish castle, leaving behind the muddy roads and fields. The air changes, the scent of smoke from the kitchens, damp stone from the walls, and occasionally the pungent smell of horses in the stables. Life within these fortresses wasn't solely about war. It was daily existence, with its own rhythms of work, duty, and survival. At dawn, the castle awakened. Servants hurried through narrow corridors, carrying buckets of water drawn from courtyard wells. The clang of iron pots echoed from the kitchens, where fires were stoked and bread baked. Children of noble families, still drowsy, were dressed by attendants in woolen tunics, their hair combed before lessons with a tutor or priest. The smell of straw and rushes filled the air, as floors were often strewn with them, changed only when excessively soiled. The great hall was the central hub. By day, it served as a dining hall, gathering place, and court. People sat at long wooden tables according to rank, the lord and lady at the head, knights and officials nearby, and servants further down. Meals were substantial but simple: bread, cheese, salted meats, and ale from casks. Conversation flowed over the crackling fire, mingling laughter, news, and occasional dispute. At night, the hall transformed, sometimes hosting feasts with music, storytelling, and harp playing. Yet, even during celebrations, the flickering torchlight served as a reminder of ever-present danger. Life was structured by rank. Lords and ladies enjoyed private chambers adorned with tapestries to soften the cold stone. Knights trained in the courtyards, practicing swordsmanship and horsemanship, their armor clinking. Servants worked tirelessly, tending animals, repairing walls, and cleaning floors. For them, castle life was arduous, yet it provided protection behind high walls during raids. Defenses shaped every aspect of the structure. Staircases spiraled upward in tight curves, designed to favor right-handed defenders against attackers. Narrow arrow slits pierced the walls, admitting thin shafts of light. Storerooms below held salted fish, dried beans, and casks of ale, prepared for sieges lasting weeks. Even the placement of wells demonstrated foresight. Water had to be accessible within the walls if enemies cut off external supplies. Yet amidst this practicality, beauty existed. Some castles boasted intricate carvings above doorways, or vibrantly colored banners fluttering in the wind. Harpers and poets were frequent guests, their songs and tales relieving the monotony of stone and duty. Even during hardship, people craved stories, music, and color to brighten the gray walls. For children growing up in these castles, the building was both home and fortress. They learned to climb towers, watch soldiers train, and heed the elders' teachings on loyalty and honor. Sons of noble families were often fostered with allied clans or families, building ties that might prove crucial. Daughters were taught household management, alliance building, and subtle influence over powerful men. The castle was more than stone and mortar. It was a stage where lives unfolded, each person playing a role in the community's survival. While often depicted as solely battlegrounds, their walls resonated daily with the sounds of ordinary life. Children laughing, dogs barking, blacksmiths hammering, and bells marking the passage of time. Walking through one today, even in ruins, evokes these echoes. The walls may be silent, but they once held stories of birth, love, work, fear, and faith. Daily life within a medieval Irish castle wasn't just about preparing for war. It was about enduring, living, and finding moments of humanity amidst the cold gray stone. The Gaelic Brehon laws versus Norman feudal rule. Every society requires rules for cohesion. In medieval Ireland, two vastly different legal systems often clashed. On one side were the ancient Gaelic Brehon laws, a network of customs guiding Irish life for centuries. On the other was a Norman feudal system, arriving with castles, knights, and claims of royal authority. Side by side, they revealed not just two methods of governance, but two distinct worldviews. The Brehon laws predated Christianity in Ireland, passed down through oral tradition long before being written. They weren't created by kings, but upheld by Brehons, learned judges embodying generations of wisdom. These weren't political rulers, but neutral arbiters respected for their knowledge and impartiality. Their role was to interpret and apply existing customs, not to invent them. Thus, the law seemed to belong to the people, not the crown. These laws valued balance and restitution over punishment. Stolen cattle required repayment, often with interest. Injurious acts demanded compensation to restore honor and mend a rift. Execution and imprisonment were rare, almost foreign concepts. Justice aimed to restore harmony, not crush the guilty. Even poets and scholars were legally protected, holding special status as tradition's guardians. The system was deeply intertwined with kinship. Responsibility fell not only on the individual, but often on the wider family or clan. Honor and blame were shared, creating a tightly knit society where each person's actions reflected on their kin. Even nobles were accountable, for no one was above the law. Furthermore, the system recognized women's rights more extensively than many other medieval legal codes. Women could inherit land, own property, and in certain cases, divorce their husbands. One law even allowed a woman to leave a marriage if her husband became too obese to fulfill his marital duties, a detail striking even today, illustrating the system's practicality and humanity. The Normans, however, introduced a drastically different system. Their feudal rule was hierarchical. At the apex stood the king, followed by lords, then vassals and peasants bound by oaths and obligations. Land wasn't held communally or shared among kin, but structured in rigid chains of ownership, granted as rewards for loyalty and service. The king's word was law, and transgressions faced severe penalties: execution, forfeiture of lands, or imprisonment. Justice under this system wasn't about restoring harmony, but enforcing obedience. Imagine confusion when these worlds collided. In Gaelic territories, disputes might be settled through negotiation under a Brehon's calm guidance, with compensation carefully calculated in cattle or goods. In Norman strongholds, disputes were judged in a stone hall by a stern lord imposing fines or punishments in the king's name. A farmer caught between these systems could find himself pulled in opposite directions, one law demanding restitution, the other demanding submission. This clash wasn't solely about rules. It was about values. The Brehon system viewed law as a living, evolving tradition deeply intertwined with kinship and community bonds. The Normans, conversely, saw law as a tool of absolute control, a means of binding Irish society to the will of the English crown. This fundamental clash of legal philosophies profoundly and intricately shaped the course of Irish life for centuries. The resulting tension manifested in diverse and often contradictory ways. Some Norman lords, having spent considerable time living amongst the Irish, gradually adopted Gaelic customs, even choosing to resolve disputes through the Brehon system. Others, however, fiercely clung to feudal law, viewing it as a tangible symbol of the supposed cultural and societal superiority. For the ordinary Irish people, this duality must have been disorienting, a bewildering juxtaposition of legal systems. Yet, paradoxically, it also offers certain practicality. In many regions, individuals could strategically select a legal system that best served their immediate needs and interests, opting for Brehon justice when it favored their case, and turning to Norman courts when greater security or more predictable outcomes seemed likely. This resulted in a complex, uneven, and constantly shifting patchwork of legal practices across the island, mirroring the volatile and unpredictable nature of the political landscape itself. The resilience of Brehon law is truly remarkable. Despite facing immense pressure from the Norman imposition of feudal law, Brehon law continued to be practiced in predominantly Gaelic region for centuries, persisting in some areas well into the 17th century. Its very survival represents a quiet but powerful act of resistance, a testament to the enduring strength of Irish identity, demonstrating that conquest alone could not erase deeply ingrained cultural practices and legal traditions. Conversely, Norman law, despite its powerful backing by the English crown, never fully established itself within the core Gaelic heartlands. The coexistence of these two distinct legal systems reveals a medieval Ireland far more nuanced and complex than often depicted, a place of overlapping traditions, inherent conflict, and, at times, surprisingly harmonious coexistence. The inherent tension between the principles of restitution, Brehon, and punishment, Norman, between kinship-based justice and crown-based authority, between the pursuit of harmony and the imposition of hierarchy, unveils a deeper, more profound understanding of the Irish experience itself. It reveals a land perpetually negotiating between the old and the new, constantly adapting and evolving while tenaciously preserving its unique cultural identity. Monastic schools, repositories of knowledge and hidden treasures, offered a stark contrast to the violence and power struggles of the era. They represented a quieter, gentler world existing alongside, yet distinct from, the clang of swords and the imposing presence of Norman castles. Scattered across the island, these monasteries were more than just centers of religious devotion. They served as vital centers of learning and knowledge preservation. Monks diligently tended not only to their spiritual duties, but also to meticulous preservation and transmission of knowledge. These monastic schools were instrumental in fostering Ireland's reputation as a land of saints and scholars, a beacon of learning and wisdom in a time of widespread upheaval and uncertainty. Imagine a small, unassuming stone monastery nestled amidst rolling hills, a picture of quiet resilience in the face of a turbulent world. The monastery walls, simple and functional, speak of endurance rather than ostentation. Inside, cloisters enclose a tranquil garden where medicinal herbs are cultivated, while the gentle chiming of bells marks the passage of time. Within this serene setting, monks adhere to a rigorous daily routine of prayer, study, and manual labor. But the true treasures of these monasteries resided within their scriptoria, their writing rooms. By the flickering light of candles, scribes meticulously copied texts, painstakingly rendering line after line with unwavering precision and devotion. These were not just sacred scriptures. They included invaluable fragments of Latin texts, historical accounts, and poetic works that might otherwise have been lost forever. Some pages featured elaborate, intricate designs, swirling spirals, fantastical creatures, vibrant bursts of color in gold leaf, transforming the written word into visual prayers, expressions of faith transformed into art. Masterpieces such as the Book of Kells and the Book of Dao, still awe-inspiring today, serve as radiant reminders of the monks' unwavering dedication to beauty and truth. These monastic schools were not merely centers of manuscript production. They were also vibrant centers of education. Students, drawn from diverse backgrounds, gathered around their masters to receive instruction in Latin, theology, mathematics, and law. Some hailed from wealthy families, hoping their sons would rise to prominence as priests or scholars, while others came from humbler origins, driven by the allure of learning in an age where literacy itself was a rare and valuable commodity. The atmosphere within these schools was one of hushed recitation, the rhythmic scratching of quills, and the gentle flow of knowledge being passed down through generations. However, alongside this pursuit of wisdom came the ever-present threat of violence. The precious treasures held within these monasteries, jeweled manuscripts, golden chalices, reliquaries encrusted with gems, made them irresistible targets for raiders. Long before the Norman invasions, Vikings had repeatedly plundered monasteries, carrying off valuable artifacts, and sometimes even burning entire libraries to the ground. Even in later centuries, warring chieftains and rival clans frequently targeted these sanctuaries, seeking to plunder their wealth. In response to these threats, monks often incorporated round towers into their monastery complexes, tall, slender structures with doors positioned high above ground level. When raiders attacked, the monks would retreat into these towers, drawing up ladders behind them, securing their precious books and treasures within the safety of the stone walls. Many manuscripts and sacred objects survived only because monks, anticipating potential attacks, carefully concealed them beneath floorboards, within walls, or inside securely sealed caskets. Some of these hidden treasures were rediscovered centuries later. Their colors were remarkably vibrant, their pages still whispering tales across the ages. Others remain lost, buried by the relentless passage of time, perhaps awaiting future discovery in the depths of bogs or amidst the ruins of forgotten monasteries. Despite the ever-present dangers, these monastic schools shone as beacons of light in the darkness, preserving not only Ireland's unique culture, but also safeguarding fragments of the classical world. Texts of philosophy, medicine, and science that might have otherwise vanished completely. Travelers from other lands often expressed amazement at the depth of learning found in these monasteries, describing Ireland as an island of wisdom, a place where saints and scholars walk side by side. In the tranquil stillness of these monastic centers, we find a powerful counterpoint to the conflicts and power struggles that so often dominate historical narratives. These monasteries remind us that the medieval world was composed not only of steel and stone, but also of ink and prayer, the treasures they guarded, both the physical manuscripts and the intangible gift of learning, were as crucial to Ireland's survival as any fortress or weapon. And even centuries later, their legacy continues to flicker, much like the candlelight on vellum, soft yet enduring. The power of myth, encompassing fairies, heroes, and sacred sites, constitute another significant force shaping the medieval Irish landscape, existing alongside the more tangible realities of law, warfare, and castle construction. For the Irish people, stories were not merely entertainment. They were integral threads woven into the very fabric of daily life, connecting the past and present, the tangible world to the unseen realm of the supernatural. Myths breathed quietly in fields, forests, and stone circles, carried on the wind in whispers and songs. Even with the spread of Christianity, these ancient tales persisted, coexisting with biblical narratives, never fully fading into obscurity. The fairies, or the Owl Sea, were not the playful figures of later folklore, but potent beings inextricably linked to the land itself. They were believed to reside in ancient burial mounds and hills, within the hollows of trees, or beneath ancient standing stones. Disturbing their dwelling places was considered incredibly dangerous. A farmer might hesitate before plowing too near a fairy fort, offering appeasance of milk or bread as quiet act of respect to maintain harmony with the unseen world. Some believe that fairy paths, lines traversing the landscape and connecting sacred mounds, must remain undisturbed, as obstructing one was believed to invite misfortune into one's home. These stories, passed down from parent to child, imbued the Irish landscape with an aura of mystery, each hill and shadowed glen concealing a secret. Heroes also lived on in memory. Tales of Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster, orphan Mac Cumhale and his band of warriors, the Fianna, were recounted in smoky halls during long winter nights. These were not mere tales of adventure. They conveyed valuable lessons of courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. Children grew up hearing these stories, their imaginations ignited by narratives of battles against impossible odds, hunts through enchanted forests, and duels where fate itself seemed to intervene. Even nobles and monks, despite their piety, found themselves captivated by these mythical narratives. Myth was as integral to Ireland's soul as prayer itself. Then there were the sacred sites, ancient stone circles, dolmens, and passage tombs scattered across the countryside, monuments erected by ancestors long before the Middle Ages. By medieval times, people may not have fully understood their true origins, but they undeniably felt their power. A great burial mound might be considered the resting place of a mythical king, a stone circle a gateway to the otherworld. Pilgrims flocked to wells believed to possess healing waters, and warriors swore oaths beside standing stones. Even in an age of church bells and illuminated manuscripts, the voices of the ancient stones still resonated powerfully. Other myths were interwoven into the very rhythms of life. The Banshee, a figure both feared and revered, was believed to wail at night when death approached a household, her cry echoing through the valleys like the wind itself. Blackthorn trees were thought to shelter restless spirits, while hawthorn bushes were left untouched, lest one offend the fairies believed to dwell within them. Samhain, the festival marking the boundary between the old and new seasons, held particular significance. The veil between the living and the dead was believed to thin at this time. Fires were lit to ward off harmful spirits, and food was left at doorways as offerings for wandering souls. This blending of myth and faith gave medieval Ireland a unique character. A monk might spend his day copying the Gospels, and his evening listening to a bard sing of Cú Chulainn. A clan chief might pray in a chapel, and then leave an offering at a sacred well. For the medieval Irish, there was no rigid separation between the sacred and the mythical. Both shaped their worldview, provided meaning, and connected them to something greater than themselves. The enduring power of these myths lies in their subtle, pervasive influence on daily life. A farmer refusing to cut down a fairy tree, a warrior bearing the name of a legendary hero, a mother cautioning her child against venturing too near certain hills, All were expressions of belief that kept the old stories vibrant and alive. Even today, centuries later, as one walks through the Irish countryside, it is easy to sense the lingering presence of these myths. Thus, medieval Ireland was not just a land of stone castles and clan rivalries. It was also shaped by unseen presences, by heroes long deceased but never forgotten, and by sacred places where the boundary between worlds felt remarkably thin. Myths infused the ordinary with wonder, gave color to daily life, and offered solace in the face of hardship and the struggle for survival. In their quiet, persistent way, these myths were as vital as law, steel, cattle raids, warfare, and the warrior code itself. If myths provided Ireland's rich tapestry of color, warfare gave it sharp, defining edge. In the medieval Irish world, conflict was a constant presence, and at the very heart of Gaelic warfare lay something surprisingly simple: cattle. Cattle represented wealth, status, and survival itself. Stealing a herd from a rival clan was not mere theft. It was an overt declaration of strength, a public challenge that demanded a response. These raids, known as Tyne, were deeply ingrained in the rhythm of life, celebrated in song and feared in reality. Imagine a moonlit night on the edge of a valley, the air crisp and cool, the grass glistening with dew. Warriors move silently through the shadows, cloaks drawn tight against the chill. Then, with a sudden, thunderous cry, they stampede a rival clan's cattle, the sound of hooves pounding the earth echoing through the night. For the victims, the loss was catastrophic, representing not just a deprivation of food, but a significant blow to their power and prestige. For the raiders, success brought glory, tangible proof of bravery and skill. However, warfare in Ireland was far more than simply about cattle. Honor was a true currency, and battles were fought to defend it fiercely. A chief's reputation was paramount. Appearing weak invited attack, while a reputation for ferocity deterred potential enemies. Warriors adhered to a strict code that demanded courage, unwavering loyalty to their kin, and a readiness to shed blood when honor was called into question. Songs were composed not only to commemorate victories, but also to celebrate individual acts of valor. A warrior holding a fort against overwhelming odds, another besting a rival champion in single combat. In this world, the memory of bravery was as significant as the battle itself. Weapons were simple but deadly. Spears were the most common, their iron points gleaming in the sunlight. Valued weapons were passed down through generations, often given names and immortalized in song. Shields were painted in vibrant colors, serving as both protection and symbols of clan pride. Axes, too, were frequently employed, functioning as both tools and weapons. Battles were often small-scale skirmishes rather than massive clashes, but they were no less ferocious. A single victory could dramatically alter the balance of power between clans, affecting the flow of tribute, marriage alliances, or land ownership. The life of a warrior was not solely about fighting. It was fundamentally about belonging. A young man might be fostered with another clan, rigorously trained in weaponry, and instilled with loyalty from boyhood. He would grow up alongside comrades who were closer than brothers, bound together by shared risks and shared honor. When they marched to battle, their fates were intertwined, their voices blending in defiance of death. A warrior who fell in combat was not mourned in silence, but celebrated in verse, his deeds immortalized by poets who granted him a form of immortality through song. While raids and wars were undeniably bloody, they were not entirely lawless. They were governed by certain rules and codes within the framework of Brehon law. Women and clergy were supposed to be spared, though this was not always respected in practice. Honor was earned through fair combat, not through the slaughter of the helpless. Even the spoils of war were expected to be distributed equitably, with cattle, weapons, and captives allocated according to established customs. These codes provided a framework of structure, even amidst the chaos of battle. The most celebrated cattle raid of all, recounted in the epic saga Táin Bó Cúailnge, serves as a kind of mirror reflecting realities of life, with myth mirroring reality. In this tale, the hero Cú Chulainn defends Ulster against an invading army seeking to steal a magnificent bull. While larger than life, the story encapsulates profound truths about courage, loyalty, and the central role of cattle in Gaelic culture. Every warrior who listened to this tale by firelight must have felt its resonance with his own life and experiences. But the warrior's code extended beyond the battlefield. It encompassed hospitality, generosity, and honor in times of peace. A chieftain's standing was judged not only by his military victories, but also by his ability to provide for his followers, by the lavishness of his feasts, and by the fairness of his dealings with his kin. Refusing hospitality was considered shameful. Extending it even to an enemy was a mark of exceptional greatness. Thus, war and peace were both governed by the same unifying thread: honor. For ordinary farmers, however, raids brought only fear. The sight of smoke rising from a neighbor's homestead, the sound of hooves in the night, or the clash of steel, all potentially signaling ruin. The loss of a herd meant not just hunger, but profound humiliation. Families lived with a constant awareness that the next dawn might bring raiders cresting the hill. For them, the warrior's code was simultaneously a source of protection and a looming threat, offering a degree of order but never guaranteeing safety. Cattle, in many ways, were the lifeblood of the Gaelic economy. They served as a unit of currency for fines under Brehon law, were used to seal marriage contracts, to reward loyalty, and to display social status. A wealthy clan was one whose pastures teemed with cattle, and whose warriors could protect and expand those herds. Stealing cattle, therefore, was not merely about acquiring wealth. It was a direct assault on a rival clan's very honor. And because honor demanded a response, raids often spiraled into unending cycles of revenge, passed down through generations. The training of warriors was as crucial as the raids themselves. Boys were trained from a young age in the use of spears, horsemanship, wrestling, and the endurance of hardship. Courage was instilled through stories as much as through practice. Tales of Cuchulainn ferocity, of Finn's wisdom, of the Fianna's unwavering loyalty. These stories serve as a kind of manual for life, shaping expectations of what it meant to be a warrior. To flinch in battle was disgrace. To stand firm, even when outnumbered, was the highest honor. Yet beneath all the valor, warfare was also deeply practical. Raids were carefully timed to coincide with seasons when cattle were fattened, pastures were lush, and weather conditions allowed for swift movement. Warriors possessed an intimate knowledge of their land. Every bog, ford, and hill that might conceal an ambush. Battles were not always about brute strength, but also about cunning, speed, and a keen understanding of the terrain. The rituals surrounding warfare were also significant. Before battle, warriors might adorn themselves with war paint, ritually sharpen their weapons, or seek blessings from poets and druids. Oaths were sworn, sometimes on sacred stones or holy relics, binding men to courage under penalty of dishonor. After battle, victories were celebrated with lavish feasts, defeats with mourning, both marked by the enduring power of poetry, for words were as lasting as wounds. To outsiders, such as Norman chroniclers, Gaelic warfare may have appeared chaotic, almost lawless, but within the clans, it was anything but. It followed its own rhythms, codes, and traditions that gave it meaning and structure. For the Normans, land was held by charter and defended by castles. For the Irish, land was lived upon, defended by kinship ties, and measured in cattle. These differences were not simply economic. They were fundamental differences in identity and worldview. Ultimately, cattle raids and warfare were not just about survival. They were powerful performances of strength, deeply woven into the very fabric of Ireland's medieval soul. Each raid was a test of courage, each battle a stage where honor was either won or lost. In the songs of poets, these moments lived on forever, echoing through the centuries, proof that in Ireland, bravery was as valued as life itself. Marriage alliances and betrayals among clans further complicated the intricate tapestry of medieval Irish society. Not every alliance was forged in the crucible of battle. Many were sealed at the marriage hearth, where hands met and oaths were whispered between families. In a world of rival clans and volatile loyalties, marriage was as much a weapon as a sword. It could unite enemies in peace, solidify claims to land, or secure loyalty where blood ties alone were insufficient. Yet, just as often, these unions led to betrayal, broken promises, and bitter feuds that erupted into open warfare. Picture a grand hall, torches casting flickering light against the stone walls, a feast laid out in honor of a new marriage. Musicians play softly, guests raise their cups in celebration. At the center, The bride and groom sit, surrounded by their watchful families. To outsiders, it might seem a scene of unadulterated joy, but beneath the smiles lies a current of calculation. What lands accompany this union? What alliances will be strengthened? Who will gain power, and who might lose it? In these halls, love was often secondary. Marriage was essentially politics expressed in flesh and bone. Among the Gaelic clans, kinship was paramount, and a marriage could extend a network of alliances across valleys and mountains. A daughter given in marriage to another clan might serve as a bridge to peace, her children binding two bloodlines together. Yet, peace was rarely straightforward. If one side felt dishonored, or promises regarding dowry and land were broken, the bond could swiftly sour into resentment. In some cases, women became pawns in rivalries, taken, traded, or used as bargaining chips in disputes. However, women were not always powerless. Some wielded quiet influence, advising their husbands or sons, subtly but decisively shaping clan politics. Others became symbols of betrayal or loyalty, their stories recounted in the songs of bards. One tale might recount a broken marriage pact, leading to insult and feud. Another might tell of a wife betraying her husband to aid her own kin. These stories served as potent warnings. Alliances were fragile, and trust could shatter with a single decision. The Normans, too, engaged in this complex game of strategic marriages, marrying into Gaelic families to establish footholds and bolster their legitimacy. Such unions often blurred cultural lines, creating households where Irish and Norman traditions uneasily coexisted. Children born of these marriages carried dual identities, sometimes unifying loyalties, sometimes intensifying tensions. To the English crown, these mixed unions were a troubling sign that their Norman settlers were becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves. Laws such as the Statutes of Kilkenny, 1366, attempted to prohibit intermarriage, but the allure of political gain and land often outweighed distant royal decrees. Then there were the betrayals. A clan might agree to peace through marriage, only to break the pact when a favorable opportunity arose. A promised alliance might dissolve if a more advantageous match appeared elsewhere. These shifts could trigger sudden wars. As families felt dishonored, their pride wounded as sharply as if struck by a blade. In this manner, marriages could both weave harmony and ignite conflict, as unpredictable as the ever-changing weather patterns over the Irish hills. History provides numerous examples. The O'Donnell and O'Neill dynasties of Ulster forged marriages to strengthen ties, yet betrayals between them led to bitter feuds that echoed through subsequent centuries. The McCarthy lords of Munster used marriage to secure peace with their neighbors, but stories persist of broken promises, where brides pledged to one family were given to another as political winds shifted. Such changes could unravel years of fragile peace, returning warriors once bound as allies back to battlefield. Even within the Norman world, betrayal through marriage was commonplace. The Fitzgeralds of Kildare, among the most powerful families in Ireland, often secured their dominance through unions with both Norman and Gaelic nobility. Yet, their rivals repeatedly accused them of breaking promises, of using marriage to amass power only to turn against their allies once they had grown strong. These tensions fueled deep distrust, and the line between alliance and rivalry remained consistently unsteady. Betrayals were not always grand affairs between powerful dynasties. They could occur on smaller scales as well. A minor clan chief might promise his daughter to a local ally, only to marry her to a more powerful neighbor. The slighted family, feeling deeply humiliated, might retaliate with raids, drawing entire regions into cycles of revenge. In a society where honor was paramount, being cheated in marriage was as grave an insult as being defeated in battle. The poets did not allow such betrayals to pass silently. Songs and satirical verses were composed, shaming the unfaithful, mocking broken promises, and spreading the story widely across the land. For a leader to be remembered in poetry as dishonorable could be as damaging as defeat on the battlefield. Conversely, loyalty in marriage alliances was celebrated in verse, held up as an exemplar of good leadership and wisdom. For the individuals living under these decisions, the consequences were deeply felt. A young bride leaving her home to live among strangers carried both hope and fear. A groom bound to an alliance he did not choose saw his life redirected by clan politics. A family betrayed through marriage might lose not only honor, but also security, finding themselves suddenly without allies when enemies pressed in. These were human stories, moments of longing, duty, and loss, unfolding within the larger drama of power. In the end, marriage in medieval Ireland was rarely about just two individuals. It was about land, cattle, honor, and survival. To wed was to bind families together, sometimes for good, sometimes for ruin. And in every hall where hands were clasped and vows exchanged, the future of clans shifted, as fragile and changeable as the flame of a torch in a wind. The rise of powerful figures, chieftains, and earls marked a further significant development in the unfolding story of Ireland. As the centuries progressed, Ireland's history became increasingly defined by powerful figures who exerted influence far beyond their immediate territories. These were men who could command hundreds, sometimes thousands of warriors, whose voices could determine the outcomes of battles, and whose alliances could dramatically shift the balance of power across the island. Their rise was not merely about bloodlines. It was about ambition, strategic thinking, and the ability to navigate the complex interplay between Gaelic traditions and Norman influences. In the Gaelic heartlands, chieftains continued to rule based on the strength of kinship ties. A man's claim to leadership was tested by his generosity as much as by his military prowess. He was expected to host magnificent feasts, reward poets, distribute cattle to his followers, and fiercely protect his clan's honor at all costs. The halls of these leaders were vibrant places, filled with music, laughter, and the rhythmic clang of weapons being sharpened. To defy a chieftain meant more than facing his warriors. It meant challenging an entire network of families bound together by ancestry, pride, and deeply ingrained traditions. Within Norman-controlled lands, a different form of power emerged. Earls rose as feudal lords, their authority rooted in vast estates and the laws of the English crown. They built their strength not only on the battlefield, but also through the courts, written charters, and the loyalty of their vassals. Yet, the longer they remained in Ireland, the more many of them, the Norman invaders over time, absorbed Irish ways, adopting the language, marrying into Gaelic families, and participating in customs that blurred the lines between conqueror and conquered. Their offspring often straddled two worlds, inheriting both the rigid structures of feudal society and the fiercely independent spirit of their Gaelic heritage. This cultural fusion produced leaders of exceptional power and influence. An earl might lead his armored cavalry into battle, banners unfurled and trumpets blaring, while a Gaelic chieftain rallied his warriors with passionate speeches and emotive strains of the harp. Both understood the potent symbolism of power. Lavish feasts demonstrated generosity, impressive retinues projected strength, and strategic alliances were forged through marriage or fosterage. Politics and pageantry were inextricably intertwined. Power was as much about its perception as its application. Many of these leaders achieved legendary status. Names like Fitzgerald, Butler, and O'Neill resonated far beyond their immediate domains, inspiring both unwavering loyalty and profound fear. To the common people, these figures were almost forces of nature, entities of immense power and unpredictable influence. A peasant might pay rent to an earl's steward one day, and be called to arms by a Gaelic chieftain the next, his life caught in the gravitational pull of competing power structures. Farmers, herders, and villagers frequently found themselves swept up in the ambitions of men they would never dare to approach directly, their lives inextricably linked to the whims of powerful figures. The remarkable aspect of this rise to prominence was its inherent fragility. A single act of betrayal, a failed harvest, or a devastating military defeat could topple even the most powerful lord. Yet those who persevered became emblems of resilience. Gaelic poets celebrated them as lions in war and oaks in peace, steadfast and unwavering. Norman charters meticulously recorded their titles in Latin, aiming to immortalize their legacies long after their deaths. Both traditions sought permanence in a world of constant flux, endeavoring to anchor power not only in land but also in the enduring power of memory. Envision the great hall of an earl or chieftain on the eve of war. The hearth roars, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls, the air thick with anticipation. Warriors hone their blades, the soft clink of armor punctuating the silence, and poets rise to recite stirring verses celebrating past victories. The Lord himself moves among his men, clasping hands, offering words of encouragement and fortitude. His mere presence serves as a weapon, uniting his followers through loyalty and shared pride. Outside, the rivers, bogs, and forests stand silent, impassive witnesses to the impending clash of ambitions. The rise of these powerful figures was not merely about dominance. It was about survival. They served as bridges between two distinct eras, preserving the kinship ties of Gaelic society while skillfully navigating the pressures of Norman rule. Their decisions, victories, and defeats irrevocably shaped Ireland's trajectory, leaving behind a legacy of both ruins and enduring stories. Long after their banners have fallen and their castles crumbled, their names continue to live on, woven into the fabric of songs, charters, and legends, embodying the proud yet precarious medieval spirit of Ireland. Concurrent with the rise of these powerful earls and chieftains, another force exerted its influence from across the sea, the English crown. From the moment Henry II landed in Waterford in 1171, English kings asserted their claim to dominion over Ireland. However, their control was often tenuous and inconsistent. For centuries, their influence fluctuated, waxing and waning depending on the level of attention afforded by the distant king. Yet their shadow always lingered, their relentless pursuit focused on one singular objective: allegiance. To the English crown, Ireland was not a land of equals, but a territory to be subjugated. Decrees poured forth from London, asserting authority, demanding fealty, and insisting on the submission of both Norman and Irish lords. Some complied willingly, seeking royal favor to bolster their own positions. Others submitted reluctantly, calculating that nominal submission was a safer strategy than outright defiance. Still others refused entirely, retreating into the remote mountains and bogs beyond the reach of royal authority. Consider the elaborate ceremonies. In a grand hall, a Gaelic chieftain kneels before an English envoy, placing his hands within the envoys as a ritualistic gesture of homage. Words are exchanged, oaths are sworn, and for a fleeting moment, loyalty appears secured. But once the envoy departs and the banners are lowered, the same chieftain might rise, smile, and whisper conspiratorially to his kin, "We will honor our word as long as it serves our purpose." Allegiance frequently served as a convenient mask, donned when advantageous and discarded when the winds of power shifted. This inconsistency proved infuriating to the English kings. They enacted statutes prohibiting the mingling of English and Irish customs, laws demanding absolute obedience, and orders to maintain firm royal control over castles and towns. The most ambitious of these attempts was embodied in the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366. These laws sought to prevent settlers from assimilating into Irish culture, forbidding intermarriage with the Irish, prohibiting the use of the Irish language, and outlawing adherence to Brehon law. However, parchment decrees proved incapable of so easily reshaping human lives. Many Norman families continued to blend with Gaelic culture, becoming essentially half Irish in their customs, while remaining subject to crown. History provides numerous examples of the precarious nature of allegiance. The Fitzgeralds of Kildare, perhaps the most powerful family in late medieval Ireland, frequently swore fealty to the crown while governing virtually as independent princes. The 9th Earl, Gerald Fitzgerald, famously declared that all Ireland cannot rule this earl, underscoring the extent to which English kings often relied on local magnates whose allegiance was at best tenuous. In Ulster, the O'Neill dynasty sometimes accepted English titles and charters only to later turn against the crown when it served their interests. Similarly, the O'Connors of Connaught vacillated between offering homage to English kings and engaging in warfare against their representatives. The vast distances and internal divisions rendered the crown's task nearly insurmountable. Ireland's clans were too intractable, its lords too ambitious, and its landscape too rugged to be easily integrated into a system of royal order. Even the Pale, the core region of English control centered around Dublin, often felt insecure, its inhabitants caught between loyalty to London and the persistent pressure of Gaelic resistance beyond its walls. Internal corruption and rivalries further weakened English authority, while external raids and acts of defiance steadily chipped away at the crown's power. The struggle for allegiance shaped daily politics. A Norman lord might curry favor with the king by promising men and taxes, only to secretly engage in trade with Gaelic neighbors. A Gaelic chieftain might compose polite letters of submission, their Latin words carried across the sea, while continuing to enforce Brehon law at home. Some even played one crown against another, seeking alliances with Scotland or France when English demands became excessive. Edward Bruce's invasion of Ireland in 1316, supported by numerous Gaelic lords, exemplifies a moment when allegiance shifted away from England toward the hope of a Scottish king. Despite this, the allure of the English crown remained potent. Royal recognition conferred legitimacy, especially for Normans seeking to secure their lands. Royal charters and seals transported across the Irish Sea provided a weight to their claims that no local oath could match. For Gaelic rulers, allegiance could bring access to weapons, gold, or peace treaties. However, it also came at a cost, a gradual erosion of independence, a binding to a power that would not easily relinquish its grasp. For ordinary people, these struggles may have seemed distant at times, yet their effects were tangible. Taxes might be raised to fulfill royal demands. Raids might be launched to punish rebellious lords. Town markets might prosper or suffer, depending on who held royal favor. Even language bore the weight of this struggle. Latin and French in official charters, Irish in countryside, and English slowly encroaching from the edges. Allegiance was not simply a political game. It was a force that profoundly impacted the lives of farmers, merchants, monks, and soldiers alike. Through it all, the English crown persisted, patient and vigilant. Kings rose and fell. Dynasties shifted from the Angevins to the Plantagenets, and later to the Tudors. But the desire to rule Ireland remained constant. The fight for allegiance was not decided in a single battle or treaty. It spanned generations, shaping Ireland's medieval history as profoundly as any sword or stone. In this protracted tug-of-war, Ireland's leaders found both immense opportunity and considerable peril as they weighed loyalty against freedom, one oath at a time. Preceding the Tudor storm, before the full force of the Tudor conquest swept across Ireland in the 16th century, there existed a period of remarkable resilience, almost a defiant gasp for breath. Historians refer to this as the Gaelic Revival. During this era, even as Norman and English authority expanded, Gaelic culture experienced a resurgence. Language, law, poetry, and music surged with renewed vigor, as if the long-suppressed traditions were determined to remind the island of its true identity. Picture a chieftain's hall in the remote west, far from the reach of the pale. The fire burns brightly, warriors sit with spears at their sides, and at the center, a bard rises. His voice carries the weight of centuries, reciting poems in flowing Irish, celebrating not only the chieftain's bravery, but also the deep roots of his lineage. These were not idle verses. They were living testaments to identity, affirming the clan's enduring strength, its connection to its ancestors, its bond to land, and its unwavering loyalty to its traditions. During this revival, poets, musicians, and storytellers were elevated to positions of prominence. Families competed to secure the services of the finest bards, offering them protection and patronage. Poetic schools flourished, where young men dedicated years to mastering the intricate meters of Gaelic verse, learning to weave history, law, and praise into song. Music also thrived. Harpers plucked their strings, their melodies echoing across the valleys, their mournful yet proud strains carrying the heartbeat of a culture that refused to fade. The Irish language itself lay at the heart of this cultural flowering. While English law mandated the use of foreign tongues in courts and official documents, Irish remained strong within homes, halls, and fields. It was the language of law under the Brehon system, the language of worship in monasteries, and the language of everyday life. Its richness and rhythmic cadence shaped stories and laws alike, ensuring that even under immense pressure, identity persisted. Law, too, experienced a renewal. In Gaelic regions, Brehon laws continued to be practiced and taught. Although Norman feudal rule encroached from the edges, many clans clung to their own systems of justice, rendering judgments that echoed the wisdom of their ancestors. This persistence was more than simply legal. It represented cultural survival, a refusal to surrender to foreign models of power. What is striking about the Gaelic Revival is its blend of pride and pragmatism. Chieftains continued to raid, to fight rivals, and to engage in the dangerous game of power. But alongside these struggles, they invested heavily in culture, using poets and musicians as shields against cultural erasure. To support a bard was to declare that your clan's story would not be forgotten. To host schools of learning was to affirm that your language would not fall silent. In this way, Culture became a potent form of resistance, but this flourishing was not solely about pride. It also served political purposes. Powerful families like the Onals in Ulster and the O'Donnells in Donegal invested heavily in Gaelic scholarship. Manuscripts such as the Book of Ballamote, compiled in the late 14th century, and the Yellow Book of Lecan were created during this period, bringing together myth, law, and history. These texts were more than just literature. They were weapons of memory, intended to anchor Gaelic identity against external pressures. To transcribe an ancient tale into a manuscript was to proclaim, we still remember who we are. The bardic schools themselves became influential institutions. Families sent their sons to undergo years of training in poetry, mastering forms so complex that they required decades of dedicated practice. These poets were historians, lawyers, and propagandists all rolled into one. Their verses could preserve a leader's honor or destroy it with scathing satire. A well-placed poem could immortalize a chieftain, while a mocking verse could ruin his reputation for generations. Leaders who sought to thrive during this era needed poets at their side as much as they needed warriors. Music, too, blossomed during this revival. The harp, long a symbol of Irish culture, was ubiquitous. Harpers traveled between courts, carrying not only music but news, weaving networks of connection across the Gaelic landscape. Their songs celebrated victories, mourned defeats, and reminded listeners of their ancestors. Some melodies from this era would echo into later centuries, shaping Ireland's musical tradition far beyond the Middle Ages. Religious life also played a significant role. Monasteries, though weakened since the Viking and Norman incursions, remained centers of learning in Gaelic regions. Monks copied texts in Irish alongside Latin, blending Christian devotion with older traditions. Pilgrimages to holy wells and sacred sites continued, merging folk belief with Christian practice. In this manner, religion served as another unifying thread, connecting past and present and resisting the erasure of Gaelic culture. The revival also had a martial aspect. The great families of this period, such as the O'Briens in Munster and the McCarthys in Desmond, used Gaelic culture as a rallying cry. To fight under their banners was not merely to defend land. It was to defend language, law, and tradition. Poetry was recited before battle. Harpers played as warriors armed themselves. And the very act of resistance was framed as part of a larger struggle for cultural survival. Historical examples illuminate this period. The O'Donnell family patronized the writing of the Annals of the Four Masters, a monumental chronicle of Irish history, compiled in the early 17th century, but rooted in manuscripts and traditions preserved during the revival. The Onals, meanwhile, utilized both warfare and culture to assert dominance in Ulster, claiming the title of O'Neill as a badge of authority linked to ancient Gaelic kingship. These actions were not acts of nostalgia. They were strategic maneuvers that transformed culture itself into a fortress. Meanwhile, the Pale observed with unease. English settlers grew concerned as Gaelic customs gained strength rather than weakening. Despite laws prohibiting the use of Irish, many within the Pale spoke it fluently, and some adopted Gaelic dress and customs. The statutes of Kilkenny had attempted to halt this cultural blending, but the Gaelic revival demonstrated the ineffectiveness of such efforts. Gaelic culture was not merely surviving, it was spreading. Imagine sitting at the edge of such a hall, listening as a bard recounts the deeds of long-dead heroes. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, carrying rumors of kings across the sea and the gathering of new storms. Yet inside, the Irish tongue flows, the harp sings, and for that moment, the world feels stable and secure. The revival was not merely a cultural movement. It was a flame held aloft in the gathering dusk, a reminder that even as conquest loomed, the soul of Ireland still burned brightly. Yet, this flame was fragile. The Tudor monarchs who ascended to power in the 16th century would not tolerate divided loyalties. While earlier kings had been content with homage and occasional obedience, the Tudors demanded absolute submission. The Gaelic revival, for all its beauty, was a last great flowering before the storm, a final chapter in which Ireland's own tradition stood tall, even as the tide of conquest drew ever closer. It is this inherent tension that makes the Gaelic revival so poignant. It was not the triumph of a culture in power, but the resilience of a culture under siege. Every poem written, every harp string plucked, every judgment rendered under Brehon law was an act of defiance. And though the Tudor conquest would irrevocably alter Ireland, the memory of this revival endured, reminding later generations that their ancestors had not surrendered quietly, but had sung, recited, and written their way into history. As the Middle Ages drew to a close, castles crumbled, clans rose and fell, and the shadow of the Tudor conquest began to lengthen. Yet through all these changes, something endured: the legends. Ireland's myths, stories, and songs outlived the battles, surpassed the laws, and carried forward memories that no sword could erase. The tales of Cú Chulainn, the fierce warrior who stood alone against armies, of Finn Mac Cumhaill and Fianna, hunting through wild glens, or the children of Lyre, transformed into swans upon a lonely lake. These were not confined to the time of kings and raids. They belonged to the heart of the people, told by poets in smoky halls, whispered by grandmothers by the hearth, sung by travelers on lonely roads. They passed from one age to another, subtly changing with each telling, yet always retaining their essence. To listen to them was to step into a world where the sacred and the everyday blurred, where the landscape itself became a stage for heroism and sorrow. Legends imbued the land itself with meaning. A mountain might be known as the resting place of a giant. Even ruins, broken walls, and ancient stones were enshrouded in stories, explained not by history, but by myth. To walk the Irish countryside was to traverse a living book of tales, where every hill, tree, and river held a memory, and the myths conveyed values as much as wonder. Heroes embodied courage, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. Tricksters warned against folly and pride. Stories of enchantment reminded people that beauty could harbor danger, and that the unseen world was never far away. These tales shaped not only imagination but behavior, reminding listeners of what it meant to belong to a people, to a land, to a heritage greater than themselves. Even after the Normans and the English crown asserted their claims to the land, even as castles rose and fell into ruin, the stories remained. They were more than entertainment. They were identity. A child growing up in a Gaelic household might not have known the full sweep of political history, but he or she would know the legends, feel their rhythm, and sense the pride they carried. Stories provided continuity where politics failed. They reminded the Irish that despite invasions and divisions, they belonged to something older and deeper than any crown. And it was not only myth. Folk beliefs about fairies, sacred wells, and enchanted mounds persisted, binding the people to the land. A farmer might still leave an offering at a fairy tree, wary of inviting misfortune. A traveler might still whisper a prayer when passing an ancient stone, remembering that the boundary between this world and the other was said to be thin. These acts were small, but they were bridges connecting medieval life to a timeless past, keeping reverence alive in gestures as simple as a bow or a cup of milk left at a doorway. The endurance of legend gave Ireland a resilience that history alone cannot explain. Laws changed, rulers came and went, but the stories wove a thread of continuity through the centuries. They were a form of quiet resistance, keeping the voice of the people alive when politics attempted to silence it. Even today, when you walk across the Irish countryside, you can feel it. The sense that every hill and hollow carries a story, that every ruined castle still hums with memory. The myths that outlived the Middle Ages still live now in literature, in song, in whispered superstitions, and the quiet imagination of the land itself. Thank you for joining me on this journey through mist and myth, through stone and song. If you enjoyed this journey, I would be deeply grateful if you could help us reach our goal of 1,000 likes. Your support keeps these stories alive, carrying them forward just as the poets once did. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the past. And leave a comment down below to share your thoughts, questions, or favorite moments. We'd love to hear from you. For now, let the echoes of Ireland's medieval past settle softly around you. May the legends linger in your thoughts as the night deepens. And may the land of castles, clans, and myths keep calling you back whenever you wish to wander once more.